You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Betoota Advocate on Desert Rock FM. Welcome back to the Betoota Advocate radio show, recording live from the Diamantina Shire. Clancy Overall and Wendell Hussey here today. And today we've decided to look back in time to a time most of us would forget, particularly Victorians would like to forget. Actually, it didn't really affect Queenslanders that much. We had the corrugated iron curtain that was Anastasia's closed borders.
And the virus we're going to talk about, it hated the heat, so I never really...
It hated the heat. That was one theory. One theory. Your grandfather's theory was the virus hated the heat, so we were all right. But whether or not you were in lockdown or whether you were working in medicine or you were a frontline worker, the fact of the matter was you had to learn a lot of things throughout COVID, particularly things you had no business knowing, like the name of the Tasmanian Premier. But on top of that, we also had to kind of change the way we report. And there's just so much, the more you think about this, there's so much changed overnight. And some of it still lingers around today. Just 24-hour news cycles shrinking to 12-hour news cycles to 10-minute news cycles. All these new words we learned, mutant strain, contact tracers. As I said, they're all very good band names. Avalon Cluster, Ruby Princess. All these things were happening, and everyone effectively were building a plane while we were flying it. Today's guests have compiled and captured that moment in time in Australian media in their new book, which publishes essays from journalists right across the country that explains what happened, how things changed. Thank you for joining us, Tracey, Kirkland, Gavin, Fang.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
And we'll see today whether there has been enough water under the bridge to talk about this, whether we hit any raw notes or draw up any memories from a tough time.
I learned how to make ragu. Tell us, what was the thinking to create this book, Pandemedia?
Well, to be honest, we were talking a lot about the ethical issues that we were having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So Gavin and I both work at the ABC, and we just this is probably in the third year of the pandemic, right? We were having a conversation about these really big ethical decisions we were having to make as editorial leaders. Yep. And it wasn't that we hadn't made them before, but I think they felt really profound. Yeah. And there were so many people relying on us to tell them about COVID. We felt the weight of the responsibility in deciding, what we tell people, what we show people, what we prioritise. And so when we were talking about all these kind of decisions, we thought there's a story here. Yeah. And then as we talked more, we thought, wow, journalists right across the country, we were in the front line. Yeah. And there's so many stories to tell from across Australia.
And I think there are turning points in history, right? So we all remember pre-COVID and then we remember post-COVID, but we also thought it would be worth tracking, what actually happened during COVID, which changed the way we do our jobs and changed the way we as storytellers are telling stories to Australians. And so we wanted to go back and really capture that and talk to the people and hear from the people that were doing the stories and setting the media agenda and the way that the public really then understood COVID.
Just on a personal level, was there a moment for both of you where the world changed? I know we've spoken about the moments for us. Mine was being in another city and then going on a bucks party for 48 hours and getting to the airport and realising the world looked very, very different.
Tomorrow when the war began.
And the bucks party did make it particularly scary, flying in on a Sunday night. But was there a moment for you, Tracey, where you just thought, wow, this is it, it's all changing?
Wow. Look, for us, it almost changed overnight. So one day we were all in the newsroom, all together, having our normal kind of robust editorial meetings. Literally the next day, half of the office had been sent home. Our editorial meetings were on Zoom, and we called Gavin the tech guy because we'd like, we don't know what's going on. Can you kind of press this? But, and so we had to learn that overnight. Yeah. And then learn how to work with half of your workforce at home. Yep. And it was literally overnight. We weren't allowed to have people in the studio anymore. From one day we could, the next day we couldn't. So it was an overnight thing. Yeah. But I think for me, it was, and then your kids obviously can't go to school and, all that stuff. But walking around the ABC and having the streets completely deserted was incredible. And I will say, some of the people talk in the essay about that moment. It is a really interesting thing to think about because COVID came on us kind of slowly. As journalists, we were hearing about it overseas and in China, and then we were looking from afar thinking, we're isolated, we're okay. And then all of a sudden it was here. Well, it kind of came slowly, but then everyone has got this one point. But it's a little bit different to kind of where were you when Princess Diana died, or where were you when 9/11? A little bit different. It kind of evolved. I don't know for you. What do you think?
For me, so I've got a lot of our international journos report to me. So early on, it was when, I don't know if you remember, but when the virus really kind of hit New York City. Yep. And so there were...
The rolling morgues.
Yeah, and they were literally, exactly, they were putting out sea containers. There were bodies in sea containers. I think they made like a field hospital in Central Park. So we have a couple of journos based in Washington, and one of our journos, David Lipson, wanted to do a trip up to New York. And so normally that's a pretty standard trip, right? Washington to New York. It's not a very hazardous or risky assignment.
An Australian could drive it easy.
Correct. He was going to drive up. But we ended up in a conversation about how safe is it for you to go into New York? And it was the classic kind of post-apocalyptic thinking. So we were thinking, does he have to drive through New York City with the windows up in his car? Does he have to wear a full hazmat suit? Is he allowed to get out of the car to walk around?
People are going to be banging on the windows as he goes past.
Exactly. Can he just open the window and make the story? Or we're also talking about, do we have to put him in a town outside New York so he can just go in for a few hours? Yeah. How long is he allowed to be exposed for? Because we didn't know any of the answers to these questions, right, at this point. So that was the turning point for me, because we ended up saying, no, you couldn't go, because we just didn't know literally whether or not we were going to expose him to death, to the virus. So that for me was the big turning point. And I think that was probably in the first year, in the first couple of months.
So tell us, what is the thinking? What is the general consensus among the journalists? Did they all feel like they got turned throughout this whole thing, right? That's a start. We start talking about precautions, and then everyone starts getting restless and a lot of idle hands and a lot of idle minds, and we start creating answers to what's happening, and then you all of a sudden become the enemy of the state. Was that the feeling amongst all the journalists, that they at some point were behind this or definitely championing this?
It followed a bit of a trajectory, and it depends on which media organisation you were listening to, which social media platform you were reading. Yeah. Journalists, look, it was weird because people were all of a sudden accusing you of being in cahoots with the government and that you were actually part of this. And I would say to my friends, this is actually me who's making these decisions. So these accusations you're making against the media, you're actually... me, it was unbelievable actually that they were being convinced that together the media and the government were, doing this to the Australian people.
The ABC was working closely with Scott Morrison to
right.
lock you up.
To destroy the economy for what?
Absolutely. It was very strange. And so from inside, all we were trying to do was get you the latest information as quickly as we could do it and as accurately as we could do it. And in a sense, that's all we could do. And that was kind of funny too, because what happened was eventually some of the health advice started to be found to be wrong, and some of the health experts started to fight.
The goalpost changed a little bit. I remember the big one was all of a sudden young people can't get AstraZeneca. Yeah. And I think that was actually a critical kind of chink in the armour for the government health messaging.
That's the change moment for me when you talk about where do we go from, hey, we're all in this together providing information, to, hey, you guys are all providing misinformation, or lots of the public starting to think that there was this conspiracy going on, to use that kind of terrible term. But it was really around AstraZeneca, because one day it was like, hey, everybody, you got to go out and get this thing. And then it's like, whoa, hang on a minute, this is going to kill you with a blood clot. And for us, I can remember the conversations we had in our newsroom, which was, this is a tiny percentage chance of this occurring, right? So we want to report that because it's happening. But meantime, we know that people will start to hear this and think, oh, I don't want to have this vaccine now. So that was a real switch when the misinformation, or the idea about the misinformation from the media, kicked in. And from then on in, that issue and the perspective of anti-vaxxers grew to the point when, I don't know if you remember, but the protests in Melbourne where journos were getting spat on and punched and chased around. So that was a pretty significant moment. Yeah. we do talk to, or in the book, Rachel Baxendale, who was the Australian's Victorian political editor. So she went to every Dan Andrews press conference. So she writes about that, and she's really interesting because she talks about the Purple Room of Doom. That's Dan Andrews' room where they had the presses. And just about the environment in there and about the information war that went on a little bit there. And that's my term, not hers. But of course, the Victorian government were trying to get across their perspective and their point of view, and she's asking questions as a journo, and she got significant backlash against her on social media, death threats, some awful things. So she talks a bit about how she copped that and how she kind of dealt with that, and her idea about that she's in a privileged position to get to ask questions. But that was a pretty full-on backlash.
Yeah, it was like something we'll never see before because everyone was at home. Like everyone was stuck at home. Like you can talk about politicised environments or pressure cooker environments, but very rarely are everyone, sitting around looking for something to tee off on. Did you see any, and we probably shouldn't name names because a lot of people have made names for themselves through the pandemic, but do you see any profiles emerge? I saw the contrarian was a very easy thing to do. I can't remember his name. He was an economist from a certain newspaper. All of a sudden just said, I don't believe in lockdowns. Everyone's like, well, that's great for an economist to say that, mate. But how do you deal with the contrarian, I guess, profile boosting actions of some journalists is actually undermining the entire messaging of the whole pull together thing? Did you think some people actually believed this, or do you think that sometimes it was for...
That's a hard question to answer. Well, we read some of the papers sometimes and wonder what they believe. So I don't think that changed.
Yeah.
Look, you need to have people who have a good sense of, look, is this really true? Yeah. You do need people to ask, because it's part of our role as journalists to challenge what the government says, to challenge what the health experts say. I mean, up until then, we had pretty much accepted what came out of some of our major institutions would be right.
Yeah.
And here we were faced with a situation where sometimes it wasn't right because we were all learning on the go.
Yeah.
This was a new disease. It was moving in new ways, but also it was moving in predictable ways. Yeah. So you had health experts actually kind of disagreeing with each other as well. So because there was that undercurrent of we can't tell you exactly what the truth is, but we could tell you the latest information. Yeah, look, it gave room for people to disagree, people to make things up, people to push political agendas, and we had to just be tackling that all the time.
Were there a lot of conversations about balancing what you're talking about there, holding the government to account, holding these major parties and big bodies to account with getting information out and not scaring people because it's particularly special and different time that we haven't seen before? What were the conversations like about, well, we need to get all this information out as quickly as possible, but we need to try not to scare people, but we also need to hold these powers to account and ask the tough questions that they don't want to answer, but sometimes they don't want to answer.
Yeah, there were. And I think that the other thing to go on top of that is just the speed that this was moving. So, every day we were getting new bits of information. Sometimes pieces of information were changing in the same day. Yeah. So the problem for us as journalists and for the media was, how do we even stay up to date with what's right now, let alone, or what's going to be right in half an hour, let alone, what's going to be right tomorrow? The other thing about this story, right, is we were all living it. So a lot of stories you're not living, you kind of are reporting on, but we all had personal experience of this thing. So some of us were in lockdowns and whatever, all of our Melbourne colleagues were essentially living through the Victorian situation. So we fully felt the weight of how do we get this right? How do we provide the information that people want? And the thirst for information was just immense, right? You spoke before, Clancy, about how everyone's sitting at home in their pajamas essentially watching, every politician's press conference every day. And we would see our audience numbers just spike on these things, right?
Yeah. And stay with us
too. Stay with it.
For the whole hour and a half.
So, and everyone's like out there on their socials tweeting, Dan Andrews up in 5 minutes kind of thing. Like who would have thought that these people would become kind of rock stars? Yeah. But they all had a view on what the information was as well. So everybody, like in a sense, there was kind of this egalitarian system of information that was out there. We were all getting it at the same time. So for us as journos, our job in that situation is provide the information back to the public in the kind of tightest and most easiest way to understand. So what is the government saying about how your life's being affected by them, but also, to question what they are telling us, question the science, but follow, and this is going to be really boring, but follow the weight, what we call the weight of evidence. Yeah. What is the actual weight of evidence out there, which prevents us from going all the way out onto the crazy fringe, but sticking in the middle where, we think where the experts are, where you actually think the weight of evidence kind of is.
And I think that, it was a daily discussion and sometimes an hourly discussion about how we marry those two things. And one of the writers in this book actually talks really amazingly about being a journalist, you're so used to finding the truth quite quickly. So if there's a natural disaster like an earthquake or whatever, a whole lot of misinformation comes out at the start. But pretty quickly you can sift through it. And by day 2, you've got a really good picture of what went on. With COVID, it was just changing so quickly that what you wrote by the next day had actually been shown to be incorrect. Yeah. And as journos, that's quite hard because we're trying to be...
I can't imagine how humiliating that is. Like, in the sense
or
that...
demoralising.
Demoralising, not humiliating. But it's like, just no one likes doing a bunch of work that was for nothing anyway, in any regard. You know what I mean? No one likes to build a house that falls over. Like, spend a day on something, the next day you go, well, the thing that we were all working on yesterday has changed.
Oh, and if truth is your bar, and you feel like you're failing your audience, that's hard. And what it meant is a lot of journalists ended up getting burnt out and actually losing their sense of purpose and actually having to leave the industry because they just couldn't cope. And I think there are a lot of other issues, and what we've learned from COVID is there are other issues which have that long tail as well. The war in Ukraine, climate change, where things, actually the science changes and you've got this really long story and how you tell it in a way that's useful for the audience and amplifies the things that are important and prioritises the most important information.
I was just going to say as well, you can see, I think, across the COVID years, the atmosphere in some of those press conferences. Like, imagine basically the journos and the politicians were pressed up against each other day in, day out about the same topic for 2.5 years or whatever it was. Some of the atmosphere got a little bit kind of grumpy. We're asking the same questions, we're getting the same answers, we're talking about the same things. Yesterday it was something different, in terms of the information. So I think that was a little bit reflected in the way that dynamic played out a bit as well.
I felt like there was the politician and the answers involved. I'd never heard prior to the pandemic. What I will say is, I'd never heard that offered as an answer, and it became an acceptable one. Do you think that this followed into the election campaign? All this Albanese at the start when he fumbled on the rates, and there was a back and forth between the journos and the politicians. Adam Bant, Morrison was getting caught out all the time. But do you think that had followed on from the, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 1,000. What is it, Mr. Albanese? Do you think that had followed on from the pandemic coverage?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I suppose the more you take down the barriers between the politicians and the people asking the questions, or that kind of idea that they're kind of separate and have more information than we do, you don't lose respect, because I think the respect still has to be there, but you lose a little bit of that kind of distance. So you are kind of a bit more, you can be a bit more familiar with the way that you're asking questions. Yeah. I think as well, potentially, we had a couple of years of that really kind of back and forth about, getting into the information. There were a few kind of gotcha questions that emerged out of that, and some of those things might have played through into that election
the gotcha
dynamic.
That was what I was looking for.
But the other side of that is that the politicians also understood that as well, and they knew that they could recover from that, and they knew that the audience also had seen a lot of journalists and press conferences in action over the past couple of years, and that didn't necessarily do great things for what people think about us and our career, our profession, and the way that we ask questions and that we engage on stories.
I guess that Albanese is a perfect example of someone who probably wasn't match fit going into an election because he hadn't been in government during the pandemic. And so this whole new environment that has changed that you write about, or you've compiled all these different stories of it changing, he wasn't ready for. And I mean, we say before he lost probably 2 or 3 seats that day, in the overall election result. That was a great fumble. But he wasn't match fit. He didn't have the Dan Andrews showing up every single day for 300 days.
But it probably worked in his favour, though, that he wasn't there during COVID. It was a fresh start when what Australia needed, kind of something fresh.
That's happened right around the world, hasn't it?
And I think the other thing that's changed about the press conferences during COVID, you really saw everything. We mic'd up the journos, you saw the whole lot, and you sat there. I mean, who now is going to sit through an Albo presser for an hour and a half? Yeah. No one, and certainly not on a daily basis.
It was a weird one where what you're watching on the news will affect your day. You know what I mean? Today,
your
you can
life,
go to
your
yoga.
children.
That's the thing about this story. Everybody was interested because they were affected, right?
Yeah.
Basically, it had something to do with you.
In hindsight, though, do you think, have there been conversations that you've been a part of about potentially changing how much information gets covered and how quickly things get covered moving forward? Because at the time, you'd go from 11 o'clock press conference, we got 732 cases here, you're off to the 11:30 up in Queensland, there's 24 cases here and a cluster there. And that was happening every single day. And obviously lockdowns are up, lockdowns were coming in, lifted, etc. But looking back in hindsight, have there been some thoughts that maybe there was too much information, there was too much focus on all these little things that people got caught up in and got too invested in to their own detriment and maybe to the media's own detriment as well?
Well, what I would say is that what we've thought about is try and learn from that. I think if we look back on that time, was there too much information? I don't know, because the audience interest was there.
Yeah.
People wanted us.
Yeah.
Certainly, because I work for News Channel, which is a continuous news platform. We played all of the press conferences in full for
And
almost
everyone
all
was
of it.
watching, yeah.
The audience was there for it. They really, and we weren't the only channel playing it either.
Yeah.
So there were millions of people who wanted to see that at that time, and that information that day could have been different to the day before, and people needed it. But I think what we've learned from it is that, and going forward, is that it was all happening so fast. And unfortunately, we got caught up as journalists in doing everything so fast and across every platform and getting it out as quickly as possible and then analysing. And so I think what we've learned is that in a lot of cases, we actually need to slow down what we do. We don't have to give you something every 15 minutes. We can give you the latest information, take some time to read, analyse it before we come back to you with an update. So there's definitely lessons out of COVID that we can take forward that are going to make us better. I think our toolkit is bigger because obviously now we can Skype and Zoom and all these things, and the audience is quite happy. So there is lessons we can learn, but I think it's more about slowing down what we do as news organisations, trying to explain the issues properly, because I think trust is we've come out of this as one of the professions least trusted. And I think in your essay you talk about Woolies and Coles are now Australia's most trusted
They were for a while,
organisation.
It's where you can get your toilet paper.
Yeah.
My reflection would be similar to Tracey's. I think that this was such a fast-moving thing, but when you look back and you think, well, what would I do differently now? We potentially could have slowed down a bit from time to time, because that information was just this wall, or this becomes this, huge noise that you have to, as an audience, kind of take in. How do you make sense of it all? So for us, I think, along the way, providing that information, but also providing people with a bit more of the context and a bit more of the, how do I make sense of that? Like, how does that sit within the 5 other things I've just heard within, the last 2 days about this? Trying to help people understand what's important and what's kind of less important information would be, I think, a way we would potentially tackle something like this again. I mean, what's happened off the back of COVID, potentially as a reaction from the public to that phenomena, is that news avoidance, right? Is just like through the roof. People went from like, give it to me, the whole thing, to like, I don't want to hear any more, thanks. Please just don't tell me anything else unless it's something nice and fun, right? And we all feel that too. Like, that's something that we're all grappling with.
So tell me, we wrap up here, who are some of the journalists you have spoken to and have contributed to this?
So they've all written their own essays.
Yeah.
So from their own personal experience, we've got Michelle Grattan, we've got David Spears, Casey Briggs, Lisa Miller, Norman Swan. We've got the heads of SBS, NITV, Tori Maguire from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. I mean, we span, we've got people from the New York Times, Al Jazeera. Right. We span almost all of the news organisations in Australia, and we across newspapers, radio, television, all the commercials, as well as the public broadcasters. So we've got the really wide range of experience. But at the start, Gavin and I really sat down and thought about the narrative of this book. We didn't want you just to kind of have a repeat. Everyone's kind of telling you the same thing. So we kind of shared out different topics, and and so it's actually really varied what they talk about as well. And I think one of the things people don't realise is that there was a lot of trauma within journalist ranks, dealing with this on a every day for 2.5 years. We just talked about nothing else as well as living it. And so we talk a little bit about that trauma as well, and going forward, as well as all, the great resignation and
You just mentioned there Al Jazeera and the New York Times. Did you notice some different themes in international journalists' essays, what they were saying, or was it quite similar to what the Australian journalists were saying?
So Damien Cave from the New York Times wrote for the book, and he's spent a fair bit of time in Australia as well. I think his reflection was he was quite shocked at the different ways that Australia, the Australian media, and Australians responded to COVID, and were quite happy to, be told to, not move 5Ks from their home and not go out and, not speak to anybody and stay at home all the time, as compared to the way Americans responded. And I think that was his kind of reflection.
It comes down to how these two countries were founded.
Correct, yeah. And then we spoke to Drew Ambrose, who used to be at the ABCs, but has been at Al Jazeera for probably 15 years. And his essay was really looking at how some governments in parts of the world used COVID to kind of crack down on freedoms as well. So, and to use it as a kind of authoritarian tool and to restrict information on things that weren't about the way that they wanted either COVID or anything else to be interpreted. Stan Grant actually wrote a really amazing essay about China as well, and he talks about the virus, talks about COVID, and I can't do justice to the way Stan writes or thinks, but talks about how the Chinese government kind of human rights abuses, essentially. He compares the way that China treats people that are opposed to it like a virus as well, and the way they try to control and repress and use some of the same tactics, essentially, that were used to control a medical virus.
Lock them up,
Exactly, yeah.
Weld their doors shut. I'm looking forward to going top to bottom on this, and like we said at the start, this has been like kind of a long enough time to kind of look back at all of this and remind ourselves it happened. That's another thing. I mean, you guys don't need to be reminded. As you said, you talked about nothing else for 3 years. But thank you for sticking with it. And thank you for keeping us informed and now doubling down and doing this. And I hope you can get a break soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So do we.